Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Maritsa 1371, End of the Serbian Empire by Kings and Generals. And this is part 3 of their series, Rise of the Ottoman Empire. So last time we saw as the young Ottoman Empire continued to expand, taking advantage of an earthquake to move into Europe for the first time. So far they've been based in Anatolia, now they are taking Byzantine territory in Europe. So we'll see where that goes in this one. Now, before we jump into this video, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
In the last episode of our series on the early history of the Ottoman Empire, we covered how the Ottomans, under the leadership of Osman and Orhan, expanded the territories and political institutions of the new state, and how both men took advantage of their declining neighbors to expand the apparatus of the Beylik. In this episode, we will explore the Ottomans' sudden and deep expansion into the Balkans during the aftermath of the latest Byzantine civil war.
Right, I mean, if we remember, and as I mentioned, the Ottomans were based in Anatolia. There were a bunch of different Muslim states, essentially descended from the Seljuk Turks, and of course the Seljuk Turks had taken territory that had belonged to the Byzantines, aka the Eastern Roman Empire. The Ottomans have sort of gobbled up some of their, closer rivals, though they certainly don't have complete dominion over Anatolia, and they have a complicated relationship with the Byzantine Empire. Sometimes allies, right? We've seen different Byzantine factions, especially in times of civil unrest, call on the Ottomans to help them wage their wars, but also they have a deeply contentious relationship, as the Ottomans have now moved into Europe, moved into the Balkans, and have started taking some of that Byzantine territory. So the Ottomans are definitely on the rise to the detriment of just about all the different states and empires around them. They are the rising power, becoming the rising empire of the region.
And how Europe responded to these swift land acquisitions by a rising Muslim power. Want to expand into Europe yourself? Or maybe just take all of it? It's one of many ways to play in today's sponsor, Call of...
And I'll let the ad play through. As I always say, make sure to check out this video by Kings and Generals. I've got it linked down below. Make sure to show them some support, leave them a like, subscribe to their channel, check out their sponsor. I don't know if it's still active, this is kind of an older video, but you get my point. You want to show support to these channels that are making these fantastic history videos that we all get to enjoy.
Period. And you can adjust your empire anytime on PC or mobile. Get the game for free via our link in the description, and you'll get an exclusive gift, 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free, but only for the next 30 days, so get in there now. By 1357, the Ottoman Beylik, under the military leadership of Orhan Gazi...
Yeah, so we can see, they hold a sort of good chunk of Western Anatolia, but in fact, the majority of Anatolia is not in their hands, and Anatolia is essentially like modern-day Turkey. It's this region right here. But what already distinguishes the Ottomans from a lot of their similar rivals is that they are focused westwards, right? They are not purely focused on Anatolia. They've actually made the jump into Europe, into the Balkans, and though they only hold a bit of territory, that is already substantial.
Son, Suleiman Pasha, had managed to create a bridgehead into Europe with the territorial acquisition of the Gallipoli Peninsula. As Thrace was opened to Ottoman raiders and Ottoman families continued settling in the newly captured regions in Europe, the presumptive heir of the Beylik would also begin the peaceful annexation of Anatolian towns like Ankara and Bolu with the help of the local Ahis religious order, the same order that Osman had allied during the days with the Kayi tribe. However, the same year would also see the 12-year-old Shehzada Halil, Orhan's son, through his marriage to the Byzantine royal Theodora Cantacuzeni, being captured by Genoese pirates during a raid on Ottoman territory. Pleading for the return of his son, the elderly and desperate Orhan went so far as to request the help of the newly established Byzantine Emperor John V Palaiologos in...
Wow. I mean, hey, at this time in history, you will see a lot of these different Italian city-states, Genoa, Venice, very much involved in this region, whether they're claiming territory, sailing around making trade deals, or sometimes doing a bit of piracy. We've reached the point where these Italian states are getting increasingly rich and playing quite a role in the region. I mean, you can see just from this map, we are dealing with a very diminished Byzantine Empire, right? In fact, it is essentially on the verge of collapse. It's not like it's going to collapse in the next 5 years, but in the grand scheme, it doesn't have too long left. These Italian powers have a lot of influence. Bulgaria does, Serbia does. The Byzantine Empire, though it has a lot of religious and cultural influence, it is not the sort of big player in the region anymore. But, I mean, like I said, it does have that legacy and that history and that culture. So, not to say it had sort of no standing, but in terms of practical, political, military, economic influence, it was very much struggling.
The following negotiations with the pirates. In an act of classic Byzantine diplomacy, the emperor agreed to help the Ottoman leader retrieve back his son from the Genoese in return for declaring the half-Byzantine prince as heir to the Ottoman Beylik, paying half of the ransom requested by the pirates, revoking the Ottoman alliance with the Palaiologos-rivaled Kantakozenos family, cancelling all of Constantinople's debts to Bursa accumulated during the latest civil war, and lastly the cessation of all Ottoman raids into Byzantine territories. Orhan would reluctantly agree to John's terms, and all Ottoman conquests in Thrace were put on hold while the Byzantines negotiated with the Genoese. After 2 years of negotiations, Halil would be released and be first transported back to Constantinople, where the Ottoman Byzantine prince would wed the emperor's 10-year-old daughter before being shipped off to Ottoman territory.
Hey, once again, of course the Ottomans and the Byzantines have a very contentious relationship. They are in direct competition, but it's absolutely, that's not all it is, right? There's so much more. There clearly are very close diplomatic ties here. There are intermarriages at the very highest levels of these, two states, these two empires, one very old, one very young. So, the simplified idea is, oh yeah, the Ottomans, they sort of rose up, conquered all this territory, Byzantines fell, and that was that. And sure, that essentially is what happened, but it's just worth pointing out that it's always more complicated than that. It wasn't purely antagonistic.
The whole crisis would highlight John V's answer to Ottoman aggression by planting the seeds for a Byzantine royal to inherit Ottoman territories and even potentially transforming the Beylik into a fellow Christian ally. John V's plans for the Ottoman Empire would move further forward when Orhan's eldest son and assumed heir, Suleiman Pasha, unexpectedly died during a hunting expedition in 1359. Going into grief for his son and heir, the now physically ill Orhan Gazi would appoint his 33-year-old son, Shahzada Murad, to oversee the Ottoman armies stationed in Thrace, before secluding himself within the walls of the Ottoman palace in Bursa. However, like his brother before him, Murad would also ignore the established agreements between Constantinople and Bursa, and began planning for a future military campaign to seize the major Byzantine city of Adrianople.
Yeah, and though the Byzantines tried to make this more of a diplomatic and friendly relationship, though of course by friendly what I mean is the Byzantines tried to skew the situation to their advantage, and I mean you can't blame them, that's what everyone's trying to do, the Ottomans continued to do what at that point they did best, which was expand, right? This is the classic sort of story of empire. Right now, the empire is young. It's very much sort of a warrior culture. It's very focused on expansion. You have a couple of very competent leaders, and so they keep expanding, taking more and more and more, and then, the life cycle of the empire is eventually there's stagnation, initially prosperity, and then that stagnation slowly turns into decline, and they start losing territory, and everything crumbles, right? But we've got a long way until that. We're still in the early stages of pretty rapid expansion, and that's not going to stop for at least a while, despite the Byzantines' best efforts.
After 3 years of being inactive, Ottoman armies in Thrace would begin military operations in the region in a two-pronged invasion. The upcoming military campaign would be led by 3 Ottoman commanders, all appointed by Murad personally: Lala Shahin Pasha, Hachi İlbey, and Gazi Evrenos Bey, the latter 2 being former Karasid commanders. The Ottoman prince would first assign Evrenos Bey and his forces alongside the Thracian Aegean Sea coast to prevent Christian reinforcements from entering the region from the west, while he himself would take the bulk of the Ottoman army into Byzantine territory up north. During the beginning of 1360, the Ottoman military campaign would begin, which would see Murad swiftly capturing the towns of Lüleburgaz, Babayski, and Kirklareli, reaching the Black Sea coast, thus territorially cutting off Constantinople from the rest of Europe. That following year, Evrenos Bey would capture the militarily strategic fortress town of Didymataiko after a short siege, while Murad was finalizing his preparations for the march towards Adrianople. As panic arose in Constantinople, caused by the sudden Ottoman invasion, John V would form a new joint Byzantine-Bulgarian force in the west to counterattack the Ottomans in Thrace. However, the coalition force would be dispersed by Murad during the subsequent Battle of Pinahisar and be pushed back behind the walls of Adrianople. Consolidating all of his forces in the region,
Byzantines are trying to really find any allies they can. They are in a whole lot of trouble.
Murad would begin his much-awaited siege on Adrianople during the summer of 1361, and before long, the local Byzantine governor of the city would flee the city, thus resulting in the local garrison surrendering to Ottoman forces.
And I mean, we've already seen a lot of Byzantine territory taken, over time, but also by the Ottomans. The Byzantines have lost a lot of territory, in the Middle East and then in Anatolia. A lot of cities that were pretty important to their empire. They've just lost another, which is Adrianople. That's a pretty important Byzantine city. Of course, the one and most important city still remains for now, Constantinople, but they're losing a lot of important Byzantine centers.
Soon after the fall of Adrianople in the spring of 1362, the secluded 80-year-old Orhan Gazi would die from natural causes. His final words to his son Murad were, "Son, I've reached the end of my road while you are just starting out on yours. May God the Almighty bless your reign." Orhan Gazi would be buried in the Ottoman capital city of Bursa, the city that he had conquered 36 years ago. Being renowned as the greatest and wealthiest of the Turkoman rulers of Anatolia by the famous 14th century Muslim scholar and traveller Ibn Battuta, Orhan Gazi's greatest legacy would be transforming the Ottoman Beylik into a military power on par with the Byzantine Empire, and for expanding the state into Europe. Receiving the news of the death of his father while in Thrace, Murad would start his journey back to the capital city of Bursa to secure the Ottoman throne. Upon arriving in the city, the young Shahzada would be proclaimed as Sultan by the statesmen and the religious ulema of the capital. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, the news of Orhan's death had brought a period of uncertainty in the region, as the Ottoman garrison at Ankara was expelled by the local officials of the city, and the sons of the former Ottoman ruler, Shahzada Ibrahim and Halil, revolted against Murad's swift seizure of the Ottoman throne.
Yeah, it's worth remembering that, the Ottoman Empire is quickly growing, expanding sort of relatively easily, taking a lot of this territory, but that doesn't mean that it is completely, under their boot. Right? A lot of these people that they've conquered have not entirely submitted. Although the situation is more, people have an eye for opportunity. And so if they think they have an opportunity to get themselves a better position, rise up, rebel, claim some autonomy, they very well might do that, especially if they can remember a time when things are different. Now, we're dealing with Murad here. We have our first three Ottoman sultans, Osman, Orhan, Murad. Our first three, and also I think some of the most iconic. I mean, you could make a list of the most sort of famous, well-known Ottoman sultans. These three would absolutely be on that list. So, I was saying earlier some of the things about sort of young, expanding empire. One thing that can be very much in your favor is a couple of competent rulers in a row, right? For any system, but especially, sort of monarchical or authoritarian system, it can be difficult to secure multiple good leaders. In fact, even in democratic systems, we often don't see that. That can really do damage to an empire or a state. You have one great leader, but then someone else comes along and messes things up. If you can have a couple in a row that are good, then that can do very good things for you, and that's exactly what we're seeing here.
Hearing of the troubling developments from his Anatolian province, in a quick and successful military campaign during the same year, Murad would re-establish Ottoman rule in Ankara and defeat and execute his two half-brothers, marking the event as the first Ottoman fratricide in history.
Goddamn, shedding the royal blood was prohibited in tradition, so Murad I had his brothers strangled. Brutal. There have been a lot of different methods with dealing with royal rebellions, right? Execution's a very common one. One that the Byzantines would use. I mean, they might just execute the rebel, but if you had a rebellion from someone who was part of the dynasty or part of another dynasty, maybe it'd be too big a step to execute them or too unpopular. That was the case at times. And so they might be sent to a monastery, forced to be a monk for the rest of their life. They might be maimed in some way, have their eyes removed or something, another brutal action taken to sort of prevent them from leading another rebellion. So, all very brutal. Strangulation, that's definitely a brutal one. But, I mean, it's not like there's really a great way to go.
After stabilizing his Anatolian holdings, Murad made plans for another military campaign, this time directed at Europe. As local Ottoman forces in Europe
continued expansion into Europe. Murad returns to Anatolia to make sure things are under control to put down a rebellion, but when he thinks about expansion, he heads west. Once again, this is separating him from a lot of his rivals back east in Anatolia.
Grouped at the town of Didymateiko, another two-pronged attack into Thrace was being planned by the new Ottoman leader. Gazi Evrenos Bey would take his contingent of the Ottoman army and head west, hugging the Aegean Sea, while Lala Shahin Pasha would take his forces up north towards the Rhodope mountain range and descend into the Maritsa valley. The Ottoman military offensive started out strong, with Evrenos Bey capturing the city of Komotini and Lala Shahin Pasha capturing Stara Zagora before going on to besiege Plovdiv, one of the largest cities within the Bulgarian Empire.
Yeah, Plovdiv, which has remained an important city in Bulgaria since. But now the Ottomans, they're not just dealing with the Byzantines, they are dealing with these Balkan states. The Bulgarians first. Of course, as I said, the Serbians were another big player, so they're sort of properly in the Balkans now. They're dealing with perhaps a new geopolitical situation, but they keep finding success. The Ottomans keep fighting, keep winning, keep expanding.
After a long siege, in 1364, the city would fall to the forces of Lala Shahin Pasha and would thus serve as a major military base for the Ottomans in the region. As cities in Thrace collapsed like dominoes, Murad would further order another mass migration of Ottoman families from Anatolia to resettle in the newly conquered lands in Europe. After the Black Death, many cities in the Balkans were heavily depopulated. This made it easier for the Ottomans, who were only lightly scarred by the pandemic, to conquer and settle in the Balkans throughout the course of the decade.
Yeah, and this is a method of expanding your empire, right? So you think you can expand your empire, and a lot of times, and the Ottomans did a bunch of these different methods, you expand your empire into an area that's populated, and you just make those people your subjects. That's you can do it that way. Another way you can do it is you can move your own people, and whatever your own people means, it might mean your own people ethnically or religiously. You can move your own people in. In a more modern sense, we might call that a kind of settler colonialism. That's sort of a very modern term that we wouldn't tend to apply this far back, but like essentially what you're talking about is, a people moving into a region with the intent to colonize it, right? To populate it for the Ottoman Empire. And now the Ottomans, like I said, did a mix of these things, right? They would move Turks into the Balkans to populate certain areas. They would also rule over populations that already existed. And even in ruling over those populations, there was a variety of methods, right? There were, of course, a variety of different ethnic and religious groups. They had, especially over time, a Jewish population. They had an Orthodox population. They had a Catholic population. Now, Islam was, the first and prime religion of the Ottoman Empire, but over time, they would, tolerate these other religions, religions of the book, the Abrahamic religions, in part, I think, for ideological reasons, in part for practical reasons. It's pretty difficult to convert every single person in your empire. And so these different religious communities would be allowed a degree of autonomy. So there's moving your own people in, allowing your new subjects to have autonomy, and then the Ottomans would also convert a lot of people, especially in sort of modern-day Albania and Bosnia. We find a lot of Muslims there today. That's because there was a lot of conversions. So, in the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, they didn't follow one policy in particular. As with a lot of expanding empires, it's sort of about what's practical, right? You might do a different thing at a different time. Maybe you convert the local population, maybe you let them do what they're going to do, maybe you deport them and move your own people in, maybe you move your own people in alongside them, maybe the area is already depopulated because of the Black Death or an earthquake, and you claim it with your, there's a variety of methods that the Ottomans and a lot of different empires used.
With the death of Shahzada Halil and the Ottoman conquest of Thrace, an official peace
Just a little bit of empire building 101 for you.
treaty was signed between the Ottomans and a now rump Byzantine Empire in 1364, which would result in John V recognizing Murad's conquests in the region and promising to refrain from forming an anti-Ottoman coalition with other European powers. Although there is a lack of European sources on the matter, according to traditional Ottoman chronicles, during the same year the peace treaty was signed, a European crusade was launched by rulers of Hungary, Serbia, Bosnia and Wallachia against Murad. Marching on Adrianople, which was by then slowly being transformed.
Yeah, and of course, at this point, we're dealing with a very Christian Europe that, has, well, it's very divided, but at times it has united to fight people of other religions, mainly Muslims, right? Because there is a powerful Muslim caliphate and there's a lot of powerful Muslim states. So this is a sort of militarily mobilized Christendom.
Formed into a new Ottoman capital city. The goal of the crusade was to thwart further Muslim expansion into the Balkans and to possibly even push the Ottomans back across the Dardanelles into Anatolia. However, in a series of shrouded events, the Crusader army would be repulsed by the Ottoman forces of Haji Bey near the walls of Adrianople during the Battle of Srp Sunder, or Serbian Destruction, which would see a 10,000-strong Ottoman force defeating a far larger European host. The decisive Ottoman victory would help ensure a permanent Ottoman presence in the Balkans for another decade, and would also mark the first time the Ottomans would fight against an invading Crusader army in their history. As Ottoman victories against European powers mounted, another crusade was launched against Murad in...
Yeah, I mean, this will be a continuous problem for the Ottomans, right? They were definitely a target for the Christian powers of Europe, but despite that, right, you might think, all right, you have all these Christian powers, then you have this Muslim power, perhaps that would be difficult, or maybe they're like the odd country out. And like I said, sure, they were targeted continuously throughout the existence of their empire, But you have to remember, the Ottoman Empire has hundreds of years of survival after this point. So it would very much become sort of a permanent fixture of European geopolitics, especially Balkan geopolitics, and Balkans sort of peeking up into Central and Eastern Europe. So, the Ottoman Empire would become a permanent fixture. It's not like this was an invading force that was quickly pushed out. No, this was an empire that would remain for, we're talking more than 500 years from this point forwards. So this is a very long-standing, permanent situation that we're seeing evolve right in this moment.
1366, this time under the leadership of the Count of Savoy, Amadeus IV. In a short military campaign between 1366 and 1360.
And so, I guess just to add on to that point, sort of one of the things I was trying to get at there is that, yes, the Ottomans would be a target, but as with the Byzantines, it's just not that simple, right? It wasn't always constant antagonism between the Ottomans and every European power, right? There would be sort of neutral relationships, and some European powers would make alliances with the Ottomans, because like I said, sort of European Christendom, or Europe if you want to call it that at this point, was very divided. This is an entire continent with a lot of different powers. Of course they're divided. And so, from time to time, and often you would have European powers who would ally with the Ottomans against a different European power. So that's sort of the point I'm making. It's not as simple. Especially, there's this sort of idea of the clash of civilizations. That's a particular way of viewing sort of history and politics, where you have these very big ideas of Christendom versus the Islamic world, and, I find it very much oversimplifies things, and those sorts of grand narratives don't tend to describe actual history very well, because it's just never that simple. Everything's more complicated. There's always a mix of people. There's always a lot of complicated events going on, and, that sort of framework doesn't well describe the Ottoman conquest of the Balkans and then them ruling over the Balkans. It wasn't like it was just constantly antagonism between them and all of Europe. Now, there was, constant fighting, but there was kind of constant fighting everywhere at this point. There was also diplomacy and alliances and all that kind of stuff.
67, Savoyard forces proved far more successful compared to their Balkan counterparts, having recaptured the Gallipoli Peninsula for the Byzantines before proceeding to raid the Bulgarian Black Sea coastline. With the Byzantine Emperor openly working with the Crusaders and traveling to Hungary and Rome for military support against the Ottomans.
Yeah, we know the Byzantines had a mixed history with the Crusaders. I guess at the best of times, the Crusaders did minimal damage to the Byzantine Empire and perhaps helped them regain some territory or shore up their borders. But at the worst of times, and frankly, most of the time, the Byzantines sort of had to work around the Crusaders and try to prevent them from raiding their own territory. And of course, they weren't always successful. Sometimes open hostilities would break out. Of course, Constantinople was literally sacked by the Crusaders. It was never the same after that. So, the Byzantines themselves have had a difficult relationship with, the Crusaders. Of course, there were a lot of different Crusaders, but with the sort of Western Latin powers, evidence of that is the fact that the Byzantine Empire is very much diminished at this point. Those Western powers absolutely played a role in that.
Murad would renew his war with both Constantinople and the Bulgarians. During the year 1368, the Bulgarian towns of Yambol, Burgas, Samakov and Sliven were quickly captured by Ottoman forces, and Byzantine lands were once again thoroughly raided. Seeing that European assistance was not forthcoming, John V would send his son, Manuel, to Adrianople, now renamed Edirne, to plead with Murad and re-establish peace, which the desperate Byzantine emperor was thankfully granted.
The Byzantines, they've not got much left. They're essentially at the mercy of the surrounding powers. At this point, Constantinople's surrounded by Ottoman territory, the Byzantines can't really fight for themselves. And so they can, try to talk with the Ottomans, or they can have these other varied European powers fighting on their behalf. Everyone's fighting for themselves. So yeah, the Byzantines, they're in a tough situation.
Peace once again re-established, Murad I could now focus on domestic issues, such as integrating his newly conquered territories into the Sultanate.
Right.
Like with prior Muslim states, the Ottoman Sultanate followed a traditional policy of tolerance towards the peoples of the book, ergo Christians and Jews.
Right, that's what I was talking about earlier. Now, they had tolerance towards people of the book, aka the other Abrahamic religions. And like I said, that tolerance, it may not be what we think of today when we think of tolerance, right? We think of religious toleration, or we usually call it religious freedom today, and we think about, at least in America, the state will not infringe, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it's not that kind of religious freedom. We're in 1368, you know what I mean? We're kind of pretty far off from that. But we were talking about, a pretty advanced degree of toleration for the time, being allowed to practice your religion and have some degree of autonomy in your different religious communities. You can think about some parts of Europe. You can think about Reconquista on the Iberian Peninsula. That was Christian powers pushing out non-Christians, killing or deporting them. Of course, Muslims and Jews were both targets of that. So that's sort of an example of what else is going on during that time period. If you put it into context, you see that, like I said, this was a pretty high degree of toleration for the era.
Who had the right to protection of their lives, properties and religions as long as they accepted Muslim rule and paid the special head tax called the jizya in lieu of performing military service.
Right. And that's why we say it's not the religious freedom of today. You had the jizya, which is a tax that non-Muslims had to pay. So non-Muslims were treated as second-class citizens by definition. They were treated differently. They had, and worse than Muslims. But they were allowed to live and practice their religions and have their communities, which, like I said, was not the case in a lot of places. So, it's history, right? Everything has to be put into context.
Although mass conversion was prohibited due to the Ottoman desire to retain the jizya as a major source of income, some sections of the Balkan nobility would convert.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. There was some attempts at conversion. There was forced conversion sometimes, though it wasn't super common. But overall, the Ottoman state was actually not super into mass conversion because they wanted the taxes that they got from non-Muslims. It's sort of a funny situation where you think, oh, well, this Muslim power must want to convert all their subjects. Not really. They actually wanted them to pay taxes. A lot of the conversion we see over time came from, social elites, whether they be aristocracy or merchants or whomever, who, wanted to socially climb, move up through society, reach, the highest rungs of the social ladder. And so they decided to convert to Islam because that would better serve their purposes. That's where a lot of the conversion actually came from. But the Ottoman state itself was kind of like, if you don't convert, that's actually pretty good because we got more tax money. It's still a government. They want those taxes.
To Islam during the reign of Murad I to gain the full benefits of Ottoman rule. Perhaps the most major domestic development to come out during the reign of Murad I would be the introduction of the Janissary military corps into the Ottoman military. After the conquests of the last decade, the Ottoman state and its Ghazi soldiers had acquired considerable plunder, including the acquisition of many Christian male prisoners of war. During the reign of Murad, the Ottoman state instituted a tax of 1/5 on all slaves taken in war, and it was from this pool of manpower that Murad first constructed the elite Janissary military corps. With the help of his Grand Vizier, Kandali Halil Pasha the Elder, the Sultan's first household troops were formed. thus creating the first standing elite military corps in Ottoman history. In the next few decades, the devshirme, also known as the blood tax, would be fully institutionalized within the Ottoman state, which would see the recruitment and training of young Christian peasant boys into various roles within the Central Ottoman administration and military.
Yeah, so the Janissary, or the Janissaries, we're talking about an elite military corps that over time would be kept alive by the devshirme system. So this was a system of slavery where the Ottoman state would take non-Muslim boys, bring them back, well, over time to Constantinople, but bring them back to whatever center or capital or whatever, and would educate them, convert them to Islam, and they would be trained either to be elite soldiers or state bureaucrats, right? And so this was a system that lasted over a long period of time, and that was used to staff the state and the military. And it's interesting. It's one of those things where, it is a sort of slave system, right? Which, is obviously very terrible. But oftentimes when you say slavery, people think of like American chattel slavery, and that is not what we're talking about here. And in fact, even, in some Christian communities, parents would actually be willing to give up their children because they knew they would be trained and headed for sort of higher quality of life. I know that might kind of sound shocking, but that is the case. Not all the time, right? But, there are examples of that. So it's sort of an interesting thing. You have this core of slave soldiers and bureaucrats who, obviously didn't have the autonomy of freedom, but they ranked pretty highly and they had a lot of influence, and especially over time, they would develop a serious amount of influence sort of, beyond the institutions they were part of in society in general. So it is this sort of interesting system, but it was a big part of how the state and military functioned.
By the time of Murad's conquests in the Balkans, the two other major powers of the region, the empires of Bulgaria and Serbia, were in the slow process of decentralization and economic stagnation. During the first half of the 14th century, both states had taken advantage of the rapid loss of Byzantine power in the Balkans by annexing large swaths of Byzantine lands in the region. While the Byzantine world was crumbling, Serbia, under Emperor Stefan Uroš IV, would reach its territorial, political, economic, and cultural peak.
Yeah, so Bulgaria, it's been eaten into by the Ottomans, but even before that, this was not the peak of Bulgarian power. You can go back a little bit further to find that. But Serbia, it was riding on its high horse, right? It was, as you can see, a large and powerful Balkan state that had, very much taken advantage of that Byzantine decline. But now there's a new player in the neighborhood, the Ottomans,
thereby ushering in a mini Serbian Golden Age. It was during this period the Serbian emperor would openly contest and undermine Byzantine authority in the region by proclaiming himself as the Emperor of the Serbs and Greeks, thereby declaring himself to be the true inheritor of the Roman legacy, in addition to propping up the Serbian Patriarchal Church as the head of Eastern Orthodoxy.
Yeah, we've reached a point where sort of Byzantine political authority has really been flushed down the toilet. It's really gone downhill. But sort of Byzantine and Roman cultural and religious influence remains. And so when you have these rising powers like the Bulgarians or the Serbs, they want to usurp the Byzantine political power, but actually lay claim to the Byzantine legacy, right? And so the Bulgars converted to Orthodoxy. So, you have the Bulgars and the Serbs. They want to claim to be leaders of the Orthodox religion, and in this case, leaders of the Serbs and the Greeks. They want to sort of take the place of the Byzantine Empire. And in the long term, that's also what the Ottomans want to do. We'll see this, especially as they conquer Constantinople. The Ottoman Sultan wants to take the place of the Byzantine Emperor. So the Byzantine Empire is in such decline, it's reaching its end, but everybody wants to claim that Byzantine/Roman legacy. They're saying, well, we're actually going to take that. We're the sort of religious and political and cultural leaders of the region.
However, in 1355, the benevolent and ambitious ruler of Serbia would suddenly die.
I mean, of course, even in the West, you have the Holy Roman Empire, and the whole thing about that was, you had the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, and the idea was to claim the legacy of Rome, which, of course, the Byzantine Empire had the strongest claim to, because the Byzantine Empire was the Eastern Roman Empire. But in the West, they said, you know what, we should claim a bit of that Roman legacy too. Everyone wanted some of that Roman legacy to legitimize themselves.
Leaving his newly constructed empire to his son Stefan Uroš V. Lacking the political and martial skills of his father, and often being indecisive in his ruling, Uroš V would be unable to keep the Serbian nobility under his control for most of his reign. By 1365, the most powerful of the Serbian...
And of course, you might notice, and this is sort of the odd thing about our modern nation states, right? Today, we have a country called Serbia, and we have a country called Bulgaria, and, and so when we think about it, I've talked about this before, but the nation state has been a pretty modern invention, right? The idea that you have a state that is centered around sort of one nationality or perhaps one ethnicity. They're not necessarily interchangeable, but sometimes people see them that way. This has not been a long-standing historical idea, but has very much shaped the way we view the world, right? We look at today and see a world of nation-states, and so that shapes how we view history. And so people think, all right, Serbia, I see Serbia now, I see Serbia then. Yeah, that's Serbia. But you might notice that the territory of Serbia here, one, doesn't include some of the territory of modern-day Serbia, and two, includes a whole lot more than the territory of modern-day Serbia. You've got a whole bunch of modern countries included in this territory, and if you know a bit about the modern Balkans, you know that this can sometimes lead to some disagreements. Sometimes some very fierce and violent disagreements over, who deserves to control what territory, right? So, just a reminder that we gotta look at history in its own context, and we cannot transplant our modern understandings of things back into different eras, or we might very much misunderstand what's going on.
Nobles, Vukašin Munjevčević had considerable influence over Uroš, and was even given the lesser title of King of Serbia, and effectively ruled over the weak emperor. Meanwhile, Bulgaria, under Tsar Ivan Alexander, would also go through a period of decentralization, which would see the empire being split into 3 separate entities, all ruled by semi-autonomous Bulgarian princes. In the wake of uniting the realm under his rule and seeking to get revenge for the Battle of Srpsund, King Vukašin Munjevčević, at the head of a 50,000-strong force, alongside much of the Serbian nobility, would invade the Ottoman Beylik during the late summer of 1371. Stationed in Edirne, and hearing the news of an incoming Crusader invasion from the Balkans, Lala Shahin Pasha would send out letters to Murad, who was in Bursa with most of the Ottoman army, to send military reinforcements to Thrace at once, while Gazi of Renos Bey was gathering the remaining Ottoman forces in Thrace to put up minor resistance against the Crusaders. As the Crusader army reached near the outskirts of the Ottoman capital, the military decision to halt and encamp near the river Maritsa was taken by the Serbian nobility. According to Ottoman chronicles, the Crusader army had begun to feast at night, leaving their encampment unprotected. The Serbian nobility did not believe a major Ottoman army was in the region, since most of the Ottoman army had been recalled to Anatolia months before by Murad. With the element of surprise on his side, Gazi of Renos Bey and his 800-strong scouting retinue would ambush the Crusader camp in the middle of the night, alongside Lala Shahin Pasha's garrison forces from Edirne. Thousands of Serbians were killed in their tents, and many drowned in the nearby Maritsa as a large-scale panic engulfed the Serbian camp, caused by Evrenos's sudden night raid. Serbian King Vukašin Munjevčević and the bulk of the Serbian nobility would too be slaughtered in the pursuing mayhem.
We got to the namesake of this video, and it was over like that.
which would see the destruction of the Crusader army. Only by the time the sun was up the following morning, it became evident to Ottoman leaders that they had won a major victory. According to Balkan chronicles, the Maritsa was polluted with thousands of bodies, and the river ran scarlet with the blood of those killed during the battle for weeks. The Ottoman victory during the Battle of Maritsa,
And I will say, just a little bit related to the thing about nation states, we are getting into an era of history that is very charged for a lot of people in the Balkans and beyond. You know, there's a lot of nationalism in this region, right? You know, in Turkey, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, a lot of these places, and they have a very nationalistic view of history. And so we're getting into stuff that, you know, is taught in schools. Kids remember this. People in these countries today remember these events sort of very emotionally. So, you know, just an acknowledgement of that. Of course, I don't have any personal stake in it. And also, I try to perhaps use a more detached view when looking at a lot of history. I won't say objective because, you know, I don't think you can really reach true objectivity. You always have biases. But I try to acknowledge those and not let them cloud my judgment too horribly. But, you know, for a lot of people, this history is very charged by nationalism.
also known as the Battle of Chernomen, would firmly secure Ottoman presence in the Balkans. The battle would also mark the beginning of the end of the Serbian Empire, as the childless Stefan Uroš V would die during the following winter, leaving what remained of the Serbian nobility to
Damn.
establish their own despotates in the former imperial lands of the emperor. Hearing the news of the crusade against him and the victory at the Maritsa, Murad I and the bulk of the Ottoman army would swiftly travel back into Thrace, where the Ottoman Sultan would once again make plans to swiftly travel back to his European holdings and conduct another major military campaign in the
Yeah, that's a lot of, you know, territory, a lot of different polities that have just been broken down that the Ottomans can now ride in and capture.
Balkans after the collapse of the Serbian Empire. During the year 30,
There's a vacuum of power. The Serbian Empire was a locus of power for the region. It has fallen apart, and a new power will now step in.
1872, Ottoman armies would begin the campaign by marching into Serbian-held Macedonia alongside the Aegean coast, conquering the cities of Xanthi, Kavala, Drama, Ceres, Kyustendil, and Veria. In addition to the conquests of many towns in Macedonia, the Serbian breakaway domains of Prilep and Velbajд both submitted and became vassals of Murad as Ottoman armies approached their gates. With the Ottoman victory at the Battle of Maritsa and Muslim armies now freely marching around the Balkans, the Bulgarian and Byzantine empires both made strides to reach a rapprochement with Murad to keep their realms intact. In 1373, John V Palaiologos became a tributary to Edirne in return for retaining the few Balkan holdings he still ruled, like the major coastal cities.
John is just desperately trying to keep what remains of his empire alive.
Of Thessalonica.
And Thessalonica, a pretty important city, called multiple things throughout history: Thessalonica, Salonika, Thessaloniki. I don't know what the proper terminology at any different point is, but that's another important city in the region.
Meanwhile, the newly appointed Tsar Ivan Shishman of Bulgaria would also negotiate with Murad to become a tributary to Edirne, in addition to also giving the hand of his sister, Kere Tamara, to the Ottoman Sultan. Within only 2 years after his victory at the Maritsa, Sultan Murad I...
and you can see who sort of the big dog in town is. You know, not very professional phrasing, but you could see who's in charge in the region from this sort of diplomacy, right? They're trying to marry into his family, they're making deals, you know, different polities are becoming vassals. You can tell the Ottomans are the rising power in the region. They are the big player that everyone else has to look to, right? They're the locus of power. You know, they have the gravity. Everything begins to circle around them. When people are making geopolitical decisions, there's always a glance back to the Ottomans, right? That's how you can tell they're the ones in charge here. At different times, that might have been the Serbs, it might have been the Bulgars. For a long time, it was the Eastern Romans. Now it's the Ottomans.
Grandson to a lowly nomadic warlord who migrated to Anatolia, had become the overlord of both the Byzantine and Bulgarian empires, in addition to large swaths of the former Serbian Empire. In our next episode on the early history of the Ottoman Empire, we will explore further into the reign of Murad I and his future military campaigns in the Balkans, in addition to looking at the beginnings of the Ottoman expansion into the region of Anatolia. Thanks to Call of War for sponsoring this video, an online strategy game playing out in real time on PC.
Like I said, I've got their video links down below, so you can go and give them a like, subscribe, check out their sponsor. All right, another good episode. Some interesting stuff. I will say, I mean, we are still in early Ottoman history, but at some point, we'll get to a certain point when it's no longer early Ottoman history. Like, we'll be firmly into the Ottoman Empire. We're absolutely not there yet, but we are sort of relatively quickly heading in that direction. Each one of these videos we're covering quite a large chunk at time. But anyway, yeah, this was another interesting one. Some interesting geopolitical movements, which I always find fascinating. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And with all that out of the way, I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.